Right, welcome to my step-by-step guide to renovating a 16th century farmhouse. Today we're going to be looking at restoring or renovating a bedroom within the house, which actually needs a complete makeover. The room has really struggled to survive, I think. The floor's sloping and there's various cracks in the ceiling and in the walls. If you've not watched any of my channel before, do take a look, because there's lots of information on dry ice blasting and media blasting. In addition, there are several videos looking at internal lime plastering and repairing external cracks in your concrete walls on the outside of your house. Okay, so I have for some time been looking at creating a sewing room for my wife. We've had the option of potentially looking outside, in other words putting a shed up or a garden room, or converting one of the barns that we have on the property. The issue there is the cost and the time to actually do that. So what we've sort of decided is that one of the 4 bedrooms that we have at the house, we're going to actually fully renovate that and convert that into a sewing room. It will actually be still a bedroom as such, but it just won't have a bed in there. So I'll be showing you how to renovate a full room. So this is starting from just taking the bed out and some of the furniture, and then pulling the carpet up, addressing the floor, and then taking a careful look at the beams to see whether we've got woodworm or any other infestations, and to clean up the whole room, decorate, and then put the furniture back in. So what we're going to be covering? Well, so the floor is pretty slopey in this particular room. Over a 3.5 metre distance, it's probably dropping on one side something like 150 millimetres. So that's actually quite a bit. It's quite a slope, and that's okay for a bedroom because you can jack the end of the bed up. But if you're actually going to be working in there and walking around a sewing machine, it needs to be far better, or far more level, should I say. So I'm also then going to be looking at cleaning the beams in the room. They're actually not too bad. They're just dark and they've got a lot of grit and grime all over them. So we're going to be freshening those up using media blasting rather than dry ice, as dry ice actually needs paint on the surface really to give a good clean. Additionally, we're going to be looking at repairing the infill panels. So as a consequence of the blasting, there are small parts of the plasterwork which, if they're loose, they will actually get moved or crack further. It's not too bad. It's anything that a competent DIY person can actually repair themselves, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to bring a third party in to actually physically do that work. Then we're going to be looking at what else we need to do to the beams. Otherwise, there are sort of cracks and bits and pieces in there. Do you need to fill them? Should you repair them, or should you just leave well alone? Okay, following that, I'm going to be showing you how to decorate the room. Not that you probably need to be told about decorating a room, but we've included that just for the sake of clarity. And then finally, we're going to be looking at how much this is actually going to cost, and how much it's cost us to actually refurbish this room. So before we start, I do need a cup of tea, so forgive me. So a little bit of history about the house. So the house was first built in 1560, so it's quite an old property. The house was built, I suppose, over 3 stories, if you include the attic rooms upstairs. The downstairs and 2 of the bedrooms upstairs, they're quite heavily beamed. And show quite a bit of history. Also, in addition, within the house, and it was a hall house originally, and I'll tell you a bit more about hall houses a bit later, but it also includes a priest hole, which we've got, and also a coffin drop, and the coffin drop runs between our bathroom and the kitchen below. Also, all over the beams we've got plenty of ritual marks and carpenter's marks which show the original construction of the building back in the 1560s. So if you don't know what a hall house is, it's basically a long building. It's a single story. Sometimes it has a mezzanine at one end where the owner would actually sleep. I'm not sure whether that's above the animals which are below him or the other end. I'm not quite sure about that. But the hall house would have an open roof, effectively, or a big hole in the roof right in the centre where the smoke generated from the fire would actually pass through. In subsequent years, sort of I guess around sort of 1700s, people would then put second floor in, or a first floor, and then they will put the chimneys in and everything else, so it then becomes a more known construction, one which we're all used to actually physically seeing. Now the priest hole is a small void, an area where you can hide a priest, and it's typically on the first floor, normally around the chimney breast, and the chimney breast inside the rooms, the various bedrooms, that's expanded slightly and creates a void where you can actually hide a priest. And the priests were hidden here by the owners of the property to avoid them being killed by the king's men, and this was in the days of the Reformation. Now the coffin drop. Now the coffin drop's a curious one because we have one in our bathroom. The coffin drop, the basic premise of the coffin drop is a void in the floor which leads down to the room below. It has a trapdoor on it, and this really enables the homeowner to pass things through there which are not necessarily easy to take up and down the stairs. Typically these older houses have a very wide fireplace in the front room or dining room. To the left of that you would normally have a very small entrance hall with a front door, and to the right of that you would have a narrow staircase going upstairs. So the possibility of bringing things down from upstairs is restricted by that staircase. The reason why it's called a coffin drop is because if somebody dies upstairs, if they're left up there for a while, it's a bit difficult to get them downstairs. So the coffin drop is an ideal way of dropping that body through that hole and getting him successfully buried. So I'm going to take you through that whole process, from tearing the carpets up to installing my wife in that room so that she can do some sewing. Now, just a little bit about the house again. And before you ask, yeah, the building is listed. It's a Grade 2 listed building, and we can't do and don't want to damage any of the historic parts of the building. So we're having to be very, very careful about what we physically do. But 1560, yeah, that is old, isn't it? So at 1560, that's when the Mary Rose was sunk. Just around that time, I think it might have been 1547, 1550, something like that. King Henry VIII passed away a few years before, and then Edward VI. He was only 9 years old when he took over. That's pretty young. Anyway, now to the main part of the programme. So this is the room. As you can see, it's not particularly big. It's about 3.5 metres by 3.2, and as you can see in the corner there, it sort of slopes away. The beams are a little bit rough, and behind this little door, which is actually the back of the underside of the staircase, which runs up to the two attic rooms, and as you can see under there, that's all the original lime wash that's put on the beams during construction and in subsequent years. So that's all pretty old there. I'm going to remove all that odd timber and the insulation that someone's put there. Okay, for the rest of it, the beams look in pretty good condition. I don't know what's underneath that carpet. I've got a sneaking suspicion there might be nice boards. Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But the rest of the beamwork, yeah, that's not too bad. Right, let's start on the floor. And as you can see here, what the previous owner of the property did was to lay hardboard, and the hardboard was actually laid on top of a thick fibreboard. And I'm not too keen on that because it makes it squeak. So yeah. Not really using actually the right device here, but you can either use a bolster or you can use a screwdriver like I'm struggling to, or the head of a hammer. Quite often these boards are actually just pinned down with small tacks. So the one thing you need to be careful of is the tacks actually remaining in the hardwood floor underneath. Well, I think it's a hardwood floor. The other thing is that, as you can see, I've taken up the underlay from the carpet, and that typically is stapled down. So the whole of this floor is covered in staples. So be warned, dig all the staples out, otherwise you'll be digging them out of your knee. And it looks like I'm just about to give up here. Let's find another way of doing this. Right, let's get the hammer. I'm sure that'll work. The best way to do this is once you get the screwdriver under the first part, just give it a tap on the end there. That'll work well. Once you've lifted it up, you can use the hook of the hammer just to draw it up and just work your way along until you've actually relieved or pulled the nails out for the first part. And then if you're brave enough, stick your hands in there and give it a good yank. And that's the best way to get that up. Once you've done one, of course, it's a lot easier to get to the subsequent boards because you've got a nice edge to work off. Oh, look, we've got nice boards. Well, they're not very old boards. I would say they're probably a little bit earlier than Victorian. They're quite wide boards. They're not necessarily oak, although there might be elm or something similar to that. But they are a good looking board. I've got two choices here, actually, just thinking about it. I could actually lift all of the boards, redo the joists underneath, and then lay the boards back down. And I've actually done that in another room downstairs. It's a difficult task. You've got to number all the panels or the planks just to make sure they go back down in exactly the same place. But I'd quite like to preserve this floor because I think actually it's quite a nice floor. Well, at least I hope it is. We'll just speed up this a little bit because it's a little bit boring. It's just pulling up all the planks, but I'll let it run just so you can see how the lovely boards are riveted. Please be very careful when you're removing these gripper rods. They are absolutely vicious. Just make sure you don't leave any on the floor to kneel on. Oops, don't worry, this cable isn't live. I've tested it. Oh, and look what Mr. Bodgett has done, the previous owner, using scrap pieces of material to make it packed up to the right height. He could have done a better job than that, surely. Just make sure you remove all the nails because they don't half hurt if you stand on them. And if you run a broom over afterwards, once you've cleared up, you'll be able to tell whether you've got any odd nails left over. Right, that's all the clearing up done, and everything looks clean and tidy. All the nails have gone, and all the piles of dust are gone. It's just the odd screwdriver there left. Yep, we're ready to start, so let's start. Right, it looks like we're all clear and ready to go. All the debris come out of the room, it's all been swept up, and it's all ready to proceed. But before you actually start, you really need to assess the room and decide whether or not everything's in the right place and that the structural integrity of the room is good. So first and foremost, will it still be a bedroom? These are the questions you need to ask yourself before you actually start work. So if it's still going to be a bedroom, then you want power sockets in the right place for beds, or if you're going to use it as we will as a sewing room, then you need power sockets to drive the sewing machine and other bits and pieces that she uses. So you may want to add sockets, you may want to move sockets, and if you do that, unless you're particularly competent, I would get an electrician in to actually do those changes for you, because like many properties of this age, you have to have a certificate every 3 years to ensure that the cabling is good and sound and isn't a fire risk. Okay, so what's next? Next, can you put up with a wonky floor? I guess no, in this particular instance. If it was still going to be used as a bedroom, you could always jack up one end of the bed so that it's nice and level. And it just so happens the headboard would be on the side or at the end where it's lowest, so you would jack up one end. That's okay for a bedroom, but when you're using a sewing machine and you're walking around the room, you do need it to be pretty level. Now, I don't want to rip the floor up because that's part of the history of the building. So what I've decided to do is to put a floating, or effectively a floating floor over the top, which will give us a flat surface but will retain the integrity of the original floorboards and the structure below. And I think that's probably the best move forward. Okay, the next thing is you need to decide is what your budget is like. If you've got an open-ended budget, you can do what you like and you can do everything in the room or get tradespeople in to do the work for you. If you've got a limited budget, then you need to decide where you're going to spend your money and where is it best to spend it. For me, the best real investment in that room is going to be cleaning the beams, because some beams in old bedrooms are painted and others are just dirty and they contain probably 200 or 300 years worth of grime. So it's well worth having it done, and you can see by the difference between before and after on this particular room just how well that presents in the room. Okay, so the next thing is are you constrained by time? So if you've got a lot of time to do this room, then you can take your time, you can do everything correctly, of the highest quality, and you'll be well pleased with the room at the end of the day. If you are time constrained, well, you just have to do what you can and make it the best that you possibly can. Okay, finally, I suppose, can you do all the work yourself, and do you have all the tools? Typically, most people who do DIY, they have most of the tools that they need to do this work. I guess the only thing that you can't do normally is the cleaning of the beams, and that has to be done by a professional. You can always contact Dry Ice Restoration for help in that. They will actually conduct a site visit, come and see you, and they'll assess your beams, look at the different processes that are available to clean them, and to give you a quotation. Right, so we're all ready to rock and roll. So looking at this room, this end, that's the end I'm going to use as my reference. That's the highest point of the room that I've determined. So it's from that point that I'm actually going to get my first straight edge across the room. The laser level that I'm going to be using, it's made by Magnuson. I can't recall how much it is, but I think it's about 40 quid. But as you can see, you can actually hand hold it and get a good level. As soon as you actually go away from the level, you'll see that it starts to flash. So if it's a nice stable line, it means that it's actually measuring accurately or giving you a good level accurately. And here we are. I've now placed that level right in the corner of the room, and you can see just how much of a slope that I actually have on this room. So you can see the laser level is just touching in the far corner here, and as it runs down, it gets obviously higher and higher. And oh Christ, that beam looks a bit rough, doesn't it? Never mind, we'll deal with that a bit later. Anyway, so that's where the level is, and if you can see in the corner here, I've stacked up the laser level onto a box, and it's given me the right height. And looking over in the corner there, yeah, we're spot on there on that side. And moving over to the other side, we're not quite level there. So in fact, that end wall, whilst it's reasonably level, is about 20 millimetres out. But I can deal with that when I put the first beam on. Right, now it's time to put the first beam in, and that's on the highest part of the floor, and in this particular instance on the left hand side. I've actually machined down a piece of timber to make it as thin as possible, because I don't really want the floor to lift up too much. So that's the first one I've put in place, and I've got that reasonably level. Then I've used the straightest piece of timber I could find, which is equivalent to the length of the room, and I've rested that onto that strip, and then down the other end I've used quite a bit of packing just to bring that up to the exact level. And as you can see, the red line from the laser is actually touching the timber all the way along the bottom. Now this is really important to get this right. So the first thing to get right is your strip of timber, which is your first piece, and then at 90 degrees to that, run the straightest piece of timber you can across to the end of the room, and then you'll see whether or not you've got sufficient room for all the beams that you want to put under there. I've just turned the light off there so you can actually see that red line a little bit better. Right, before we actually start, let's just give you a few fundamentals on constructing this framework. So let's first of all draw the outside of the room. So there's the furthest wall, the one on the left hand side of me. This is the highest point in the floor, or on the floor rather, and we'll just draw that along. And then my one actually goes straight for a little while and then sweeps down, and quite often that's the case. And there's the other end wall. So you're going to put the finest batten at this corner, which keeps the overall height of the room at a good level. And then what you're going to do is I'll just project that across. That's the level of the floor that you're trying to achieve. Right, okay, so next stage, that's where you're going to have your final rafter, and underneath there, of course, you're going to have your packing piece, which you're going to cut. Now, again, these need to be spaced out about maybe 400 or 500 millimetres apart. That really depends on the recommendations of your supplier for your flooring. Now, this is going to be the reference end, so that's where I'll refer to each time. And once you get that dead straight and work from that, you'll find that the rest of it then comes into place, and you'll end up with a nice accurate floor. Right, another little bit of advice. Normally when the boards are laid down, they're pretty flat, but over time they actually end up with a slight curve. So some of your planks, and this is a section through your floor, that's the first board, and there's the second one. What generally tends to happen is if they reverse the boards as they put them on, when they dry, they actually start to curve. So you might find one is convex, and you might find that the next one is concave, in other words with a dish. Now you have to be a little bit careful when you mount your packing pieces on this. You don't want to put it at the top of here, and the reason why is because there's a gap underneath and you might find that that becomes springy. So what you want to do is you want to choose where you think the board is the most solid, and if necessary put another nail in there just to secure it down. But that will be a weak point there if you're not careful. And the same goes with the reverse, if it's concave or convex. So where you really want to actually put your supports is possibly in the middle of the beams or between the planks, and that will ensure that you've got a nice solid mounting. But just be aware, it just depends on what your floor is like. If you've got a really good floor, then and it's all well nailed down, that makes things better. But often in these older houses, you'll find that that this is not the case, and you have to be quite selective about where you put your supports. Right, so this is the critical bit. So where I level that off, that's where I'm starting, which is actually in the middle of the room. And what I'm doing actually is to use these little plastic strips, which are of various thicknesses. You can buy them fairly readily. When the distance between your beam and the floor is quite small, it's obviously a lot easier to use these strips. When we get further down the room, where the beams are slightly deeper, you can actually cut timber and get that into place, and you've got a sensible thickness then to clamp down on. But for this first end, really important, get yourself this beam as really as flat as possible, and that'll make life an awful lot easier. If you get this wrong, everything else that you work off of this will be wrong as well. So take your time. I reckon probably about every 300 millimetres you need a support all the way along there. It's not so important at the edges of the room because that's not where you get too much footfall, but it is important nevertheless. So I've chosen about 300 millimetres. I'm just using a standard screw, and where I can I'm going between the floorboards, and the reason for that is because that's probably the stablest part, and it's also the one which will do the least amount of damage to the beams, to the planks underneath. And as I said right at the early start of this video, I don't really want to damage these at all, really. So I reckon every 300 mil all the way across, making sure you go right to the end. When you're checking your levels, lay the spirit level on top of there. And what I'm doing there, as you can see, is I'm just applying a slight amount of pressure in the middle to make sure there's no gap between the two extremities of the level. Otherwise you're going to have a dip there. You could actually use one of those plastic strips, which is sort of, they run from about 0.5 millimetre up to 3 or 4 millimetres. If you tuck one of those underneath the centre, you'll see whether or not there's any gap. Don't over pressurise your level, otherwise it won't be level anymore. But nevertheless, you can just give it a little tweak. I think here I am just taking that out again, and I'm going to add just a little tiny bit more, probably another 2 millimetres, and I'll add that into there just to make sure that that first part is as flat Right, so that's the reference beam done. That's the one with all the little plastic parts underneath. Now what we're doing is to set the next two beams, and this is quite critical. The distance between these needs to be as per the manufacturer's recommendations for the flooring you're putting down. I'm using chipboard with a jointed edge, and that recommends that it's 400 millimeters. Now, as it happens, the gap or the distance between my first beam and the first row of nails for the original floor, which is what I'm going to put these beams over the top, that's about 500 mil. So I reckon for a bedroom with low traffic, that's about right. But it is important to set these first two beams as flat and as level as possible. Take your time, work from either the centre or from one end, and you'll ensure that that first piece of framing that you put down is as accurate as possible, because you're going to be measuring off of that framework onto the next runner as you go along across the bedroom and go right to the end. So it is important that you get this, and keep using your level. Put it across the beams, make sure there's no rocking, and make sure your beams are obviously nice and straight. What you can then do is, for those larger depths from the bottom of your beam to the floor, you can actually use offcuts of your rails, or rather your cross beams. Just chop these up to the size you want. It's quite easy just to turn them on their end, measure them against the bottom of the rail, and then you can get quite an accurate cut then. But don't be afraid to keep trimming them. Just take your time, and all your beams will then end up nice and level, so that when you put your boards on top, you won't get any rocking. Anyway, let's do a little bit of sweeping up and just tidy up the room. I do like to, even though they're going to be covered up, I do like to give a nice clean area. Right, okay, so the other thing that I've done is I've decided to put insulation between the existing boards and the new floor. Now, there's two reasons for this. Firstly, it gives me some sound insulation to downstairs. Secondly, it gives me a little bit of heat insulation. But I think probably more importantly is I don't like to have buried cavities between floors. This is actually a bit of a fire risk, because the fire can, if you're unfortunate enough to have a fire, it can actually draw the fire between the two layers and spread the fire much more quickly. Right, I'm just going to jump forward a little bit now, because what I want to do is just to show you how to lay the panels. So these floorboards have got joints in all the way around, that's on all four sides. You need to make sure the panels are the right way up, and also that they're in a brick fashion, so that you've got no joints lining up with each other, and that makes the floor much stronger. And you can actually use an adhesive to bond all these sheets together. I didn't in this case, but it's advisable to do so if you don't think you're going to take the floor up at any point in the future. Right, let's lay the first board. The profile around the wall here, where the floor meets the wall, is actually very, very complicated. The beams stick out into the room, so you can use one of these profile gauges. This is a Saka profile gauge. I found them quite useful just for the little bits of timber, but if you're doing a longer length, it's far easier to put a piece of wood up against the wall and use a nice fibre pen of some sort to actually scribe your mark. Then all you've got to do is cut all the pieces out. Just work your way around each section. I generally tend to do the left-hand side first, and just make an allowance, because the farthest edge of the piece of timber is going to move forward as you cut your profiles. So just take a little bit of care. You want the minimum gap. I would say probably sort of 5 mil is the maximum. I've probably managed to achieve probably about 2 millimeters. Right, I'm using standard wood screws. They're about 60mm long, so that'll take me right through the flooring boards and straight into my joists. So they'll give a nice tight fit. If you want to get your screws dead in line, just line your spirit level up with the centre of the beam, and then just put your screws in as many as you want, really. I generally tend to put one on each of the end sections, which is close to the joint, just to stop it squeaking, and then I put one in the middle. So 3 across there is probably going to be more than enough to hold this board in position. Right, let's take a quick look at all the gaps. Right, let's get this last little difficult one in place. The difficulty is, of course, that you can't move the board backwards and forwards facing me to actually slide it into the joint. So what you've got to do is to cut enough off between the panel and the wall so that you can actually slide that to the right hand side to give you enough gap to drop the joint into place. So it's a little bit difficult and a bit tight. Oh no, there you go, it's gone in. That's good. That's good. Now the issue now is, of course, that I've got to tap the board forward to close the joint furthest away from me, and that's fairly easy. I could use a scrap piece of the flooring just to avoid damage to that delicate edge, and it is quite a delicate edge, so it's quite thin, and of course chipboard is not particularly strong when it's in thin sections. So once I've done that, and I'm assured that that's tapped nice and tightly against the far edge, I then need to find some way of moving the board from right to left. Now, as you see there, I was thinking about putting a piece of wood against the wall and levering against the wall, but that's a bit of a problem because that may damage the wall. So the easiest way to do it, and that is to pop a couple of screws into the floor. Don't forget you're going to be putting carpet over this, so it doesn't matter about the holes. And just put 2 screws in, probably about 3/4 of the way through the timber, and that gives you something to tap against. So you grab your piece of scrap wood, which you've been using, and find the flat edge on that where you've sawn it, give it a little tap, and within 2 or 3 taps, it's closed that gap right up. And now you can remove the screws, and that board is now properly in place. So there you have it. That's how you fit those difficult ones. But you know, if you really wanted to, you could split that board right down the middle, and just make sure that you do that cut actually on the beam, and that would allow you easy access to put those boards into place and make them nice and secure. Now finally fit the screws, again sort of 3 across each board, 2 at the extremities where the joints are to avoid the squeaks, and 1 in the centre just to make sure it's nice and secure. Right, that's the floor pretty much done now, so let's just take a refresher of what the beams are like in the room before we actually start to address the cleaning of those and the plastering. And as you can see here, there's always gaps between the main beams and the infills, and these are a bit of a pain really, to be honest, because it tends to be that the plasterwork actually shrinks and leaves a very fine gap all the way around. Also to note, all these beams have got bits pieces missing out of them, bit of white paint and other colours sort of rubbed into the timbers, which all this needs to be blasted just to get rid of that and make them a bit smarter. Right, so just outside the bedroom we've actually got the door that goes up to the attic rooms, and this is a very old door and it's covered all up in sort of lime wash, and it looks a bit of a mess, and every time you close the door bits fall off of it. So what we're actually going to do is to give that a little blast. So we will blast the back of the door and the front, and also because the two steps at the bottom of this flight of stairs, they actually are seen when the door is closed. The equipment we're going to use is a media blaster, and we are actually going to be using crushed glass. This is our compressor, which will run pretty much all day to accomplish a clean room, and we'll of course extract as much dust as possible out of the room using our dust extraction system. Well, there's not a lot to show while we're actually blasting, but let's take a look at the results. And the results are really quite good. It's done very little damage to the plaster work, just take a little bit of paint off in various places. But in the main, I think it's actually done a really good job. These beams are really looking quite clean. Normally, when we're taking paint off, of course, the difference between the two is quite stark, and there's a good contrast between a painted room and one which has clean beams. But here, we've just cleaned them up. We've just freshened them up, ready for decorating. And the door in the hallway just outside that bedroom. The doors come up absolutely beautiful, and it's done no damage to the door at all. We can still see carpenter's marks and wear marks all the way across it. So let's open the door and have a quick look inside. We've done the bottom steps, just the ones that are visible when the door is closed. And as you can see, that's really come up really well. Does show some of the woodworm, of course, but well, we'll deal with that if it's live woodworm. And the inside of the door, well, that looks really good. Look, even the wooden lock is actually looking pretty cool. Back to the room, and we can actually see some of the carpenter's marks, which were left obviously by the builder in the first instance. And there's a couple of other marks here which look like they're ritual marks, where they're actually a scribe that runs pretty much to nowhere. Right, first job is hoovering down, and this is something that we have to do. We get rid of the dust that's sitting on the walls, and when you actually hoover the beams, what you find is it actually slightly changes their colour and gets them all nice and crisp. You'll need to actually remove the dust because if you're going to paint and do filling, you need to be as dust free as possible to make sure that the filler actually will adhere to the surfaces. And some of the worst parts, look, cracks between the beams, but actually just noticed there was just there's some carpenter's marks there. I think it just scribed across, cut across onto the front. That's fairly typical of this type of and style of house. Right, the boring bit. Now what you need to do is to go around all of the edges where the plaster meets the beams and scrape out all the loose plaster. So let's just describe what you're actually doing here. Let's do a quick sketch for you. So this is the outside of the wall of the house, or it may be a wall between two rooms. Right, I'll just draw in now a beam, which is the ones that you'll have sight on inside the room. Put that in about there. Now, the plaster, in this particular instance for this room, sits flush with the beams. So what you're doing is you're cutting a small triangle out. It probably only needs to be about 2 or 3 millimeters deep. And you cut that at about an angle of 45 degrees. What this actually allows is a larger surface area for the polyfiller or plaster that you're using to actually bond onto. Now, in order to stop you from putting that plaster or polyfiller onto the beam, you're going to put a strip of masking tape all the way around the perimeter of that infill. And that stops you from getting plaster actually on the beam, because you don't want to damage that because you've already cleaned it. And then what you're going to do is to backfill nice and level. Now what you normally do is to fill that up as best you can with a spatula or something similar, and when it's dry you're going to cut in right against the tape, and it doesn't matter if any of that tape is still left behind the plaster, it will live there for ages and that shouldn't be a problem. But when you finish putting the plaster on, what you do is you get a small fine sponge, soak it in a bit of water, drain it out slightly, and then you can rub the polyfiller with that sponge and smooth it down to a nice smooth finish. Therefore, you don't actually need to get the sandpaper out. And if you wait just until the polyfiller is just starting to dry, you can then actually rub that down with the sponge and get a really good finish. Right, just in case your infills are not in line with the outside of the beam, I'll just show you a couple of examples of what can happen in various types of homes. So in that particular instance, the plasterer is actually proud of the beam, and in the next one I'm going to do here, the plasterer is actually below the beam, so you can see a piece of timber at the side. So you may have either of these or a combination of. I would suggest that in the one here, what I would do is I would actually use a lime plaster if possible to fill that in so that you can get a smooth transition between your filling in and the actual plaster itself. Lime plaster is readily available. You've only got to look online. There's loads of people that do it. But I would suggest that you use a lime plaster which doesn't have the fibres in, so that you can smooth it down afterwards. In the one where the infill is actually lower than the beam, you want to put the masking tape right round that corner edge so that you have a nice tight line, and I'll show you that later in the video. So what you're going to do is you're going to cover all the beams in tape, and take a bit of time doing this because it is important, and make sure it's well bedded down onto the timber itself and tucked behind. Now once you've done your plastering, this is the fun bit. So what you're going to do is to get that nice blade and just cut down right where the plasterwork meets the tape and the beam. In this particular instance it's a little more difficult because the plasterwork is actually at the same level as the beam, so you might need to cut in slightly. But as you can see, I've actually painted this bit before, so we did have a little bit of an issue with the camera, but this will show you just how nice that edge looks as you peel back the tape. Make sure you use a nice sharp knife, and you can put a nice cut in there and just clean up the little bits that you've missed. Right, let's move on and do the other side, and then you can see how this particular And here's what the wall looks like afterwards. You can either paint actually before you take the tape off so that you avoid getting paint on the beams, or you can actually do it afterwards. It just depends really how steady your hand is, and if you're good at painting then you can leave it till afterwards and you get a nice clean finish. Oops, apart from the little bit that I've caught a brush on that when I'm painting. Okay, what to do about these where the beams join and there's gaps? So the easiest way to do the gaps is to actually use filler and do the same masking as you do with the tape. Fill in those little bits of timber, and then when it's all dry, peel off the tape and then use some cold tea. So make yourself a cup of tea, stone cold, and squeeze the bags as much as you can and then just paint it on. Of course, the more layers you put on of the tea, the darker it will become, but you soon get used to matching it and it will look really good, almost as if you haven't had a gap there at all. Right, just a few tips before we finish. When you fill in the gaps, don't make the surface too perfect. when you use a wet sponge, what tends to happen is it wipes it down lovely and smooth, but does leave a little bit, almost like a paintbrush mark on there, and that's ideal, and that's what you want. Don't make the infills too smooth because it will look wrong. Right, for tip number 2, fill all the joints. It does make a really big difference, and you'll see that when you're finished. And on the ceiling, do exactly the same. So where the beam meets the ceiling, put tape along there, fill, sponge down, paint, and then cut the tape off, and that'll look fantastic. Don't forget, the sponge is your friend. Please don't use sandpaper. It leaves dust everywhere, all over the walls and in your lungs. That's the room now completed. I've still got a couple of little bits and pieces I want to do just to finish off, but essentially the room is ready to move into. So over the weekend we've been filling it up with furniture, and my wife has been putting all of her cloths and bits of material into each of the little boxes and installing the sewing machine, and she's now really happy. She's got a room of her very own. So let's take a look. With painted walls and fresh carpet and fixtures and fittings, I think I can safely say that the room has come up really presentable and really looks nice. Put new Calyx units up, ready for her to fill up with all sorts of bits of material. And as you can see, the beams look absolutely stunning against the white walls. Well, they're slightly off-white actually. Egyptian cotton, I think, by Dulux. So that's actually a nice paint. And it does show the beams up absolutely beautifully. So you can see I've still got curtains to hang. But essentially the walls are now finished. Right, I think you'll agree it looks pretty good. Now, what about the costs? So let's take a quick look at the costs and how long it actually took to complete the room. So, to physically lift the floor, so this is the rafters and all the chipboard flooring panels. The total cost of that was about £270. For insulation, I bought one roll and had half a roll left over from another job, and that was about £40. Screws, £9. Sockets and lights, £75 from B&Q, and the paint, 2.5 litres of Egyptian cotton if you're interested in the actual colour, and that's actually a Dulux paint. That was £25. Let's just stop there just for a second. I apologise. I don't know whether you can hear the banging in the background, but evidently it's my wife upstairs in the new sewing room, sewing. But with a hammer? Well, fair dues. I did build the room. It was for sewing. If that's what she's doing, then good luck. Carpet, well, I decided to actually fit the carpet myself, but just to buy the underlay, the gripper rods and the main part of the carpet cost me £260. So I was quite happy with that. Incidentals, £30. Calyx units and things, well, that's really down to whatever you want to put in there, but for the ones that you can see in the video, we actually paid about £300 for those. So the total cost up. What are you building up there, Meg? What are you building up there? Well, I'm recording. I've got to start again now. I'm sorry, I finished. You could have said. Start all that again. Furniture is another cost. I think that was about £300 for the various Calyx units which we bought from IKEA. Which we're really pleased with, and they really actually go well with the rest of the room. So the total cost, excluding the furniture, is about £750. So I think that's pretty good. Oh, by the way, that doesn't include the blasting. which if you need a quotation, please do contact Dry Ice Restoration. Okay, what about timescales? Well, you know, I didn't spend 24 hours a day on this, but all in all, I reckon about 10 days to complete the whole works. So that's a couple of days to do the floor, a day to lay the carpet, 4 days of filling and cutting out and making good, and a day blasting, and then a final day painting. And then probably, I don't know, maybe a day to move my wife into that room and get the room totally livable. So there you have it, about 10 days, and you know, I think that really looks good. So if you like this this video and you'd like to like and subscribe, please do so. And if you've got any comments at all, I'd love to hear from you. If you've got any comments about what you'd like to see me look at next, then I'd be very pleased to receive that, and we'll do what we can to accommodate. So for now, bye. See you soon.